Corporate betrayals usually happen in boardrooms, with fountain pens and NDAs, but tonight, it was happening in the shadows of a billion-dollar skyscraper, with silenced weapons and bought-off bodyguards. When Vianne Morgan's elite security detail turned their backs, leaving her at the mercy of corporate assassins, her empire meant nothing. She was completely alone, until a single father, a combat veteran armed with nothing but a steel wrench and a promise to his daughter, stepped out of the dark. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of Morgan Tower, the drops streaking like tears across the Seattle skyline. At 38 years old, Lexington West had learned to become invisible. It was a survival mechanism he had perfected during his tours in Helmand Province with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, and it served him just as well in the sterile, high-stakes ecosystem of corporate America. Lexington was not a CEO. He was not a board member, nor was he an executive assistant. He was a Tier 2 HVAC and structural maintenance technician contracted through a third-party vendor, Vanguard Facilities Management. His uniform consisted of durable, navy blue cargo pants, a heavy utility belt weighing him down with specialized tools, and a faded gray t-shirt that stretched over a physique, forged by years of carrying heavy packs through unforgiving deserts. Most people in the tower looked right through him, to the billionaire executives and the sharp-suited lawyers who occupied the upper floors. Lexington was just a part of the building's infrastructure, no more worthy of attention than a light fixture or a thermostat, and that was exactly how Lexington preferred it. Flying under the radar meant keeping his job, and keeping his job meant keeping his 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, alive. Chloe had been born with a rare congenital nerve degradation condition. The medical bills were a suffocating weight that sat on Lexington's chest every waking second. Her experimental treatments at the Seattle Children's Neurological Center cost more than he made in 3 years. His entire existence was a calculated math problem. Hours worked, overtime secured, and pennies saved, all feeding the singular goal of keeping the bank from foreclosing on their tiny apartment while ensuring Chloe got her medication. On this particular Friday night, at 10:45 p.m., Lexington was on the 54th floor, the executive penthouse level. He was running routine diagnostics on the localized server cooling units. The floor was silent, save for the low hum of the servers and the distant patter of the storm outside. Just down the hall, sitting behind a desk, carved from a single slab of reclaimed mahogany, was Vianne Morgan. At 32, Vianne was a titan of industry, the founder and CEO of Morgan Biogen. She was brilliant, ruthless in negotiations, and entirely isolated by her own success. Her company was on the verge of announcing Neuro-Regen, a revolutionary synthetic compound capable of rebuilding damaged nerve pathways. It was a medical miracle that would render billions of dollars in existing treatments obsolete overnight. It was also the exact treatment Lexington desperately hoped would eventually become available for Chloe. Though he knew he could never afford it, Lexington liked working the executive floor because it was quiet. He didn't care about the billions of dollars flowing through the network cables above his head. He cared about the erratic rattling sound coming from the primary condenser fan in the server plenum. However, Lexington's military training had instilled in him a hyper-awareness of his surroundings, a baseline paranoia that never truly faded. Over the past 3 weeks, he had noticed small, unsettling shifts in the building's rhythm. It started with the security personnel. Morgan Biogen contracted their protection out to Aegis Solutions, a top-tier private military firm. But recently, the faces had changed. The regular guards, guys Lexington would occasionally nod to in the break room, were abruptly transferred. They were replaced by hard-eyed men who walked with the stiff, heavy gait of mercenaries accustomed to carrying rifles, not corporate security badges. Then came the blind spots. Lexington knew the building's architecture better than anyone. He knew where the camera feeds overlapped and where they didn't. Over the last few days, he had seen these new Aegis guards deliberately standing in the blind spots. He had watched Darby Taylor, the impeccably dressed head of security, having hushed, tense conversations in the subterranean loading docks with men who had no business being in the building. Tonight, the building felt wrong. The air pressure in the corridors was off, meaning fire doors that should have been sealed were propped open. The usual radio chatter that leaked from the guards' earpieces was entirely absent. The security detail was operating on silent comms. Standing on a fiberglass ladder, his head and shoulders pushed up into the drop ceiling. Lexington paused. He held his breath, letting his hearing extend past the hum of the air conditioning. Footsteps, heavy, tactical, rubber-soled boots, not the click-clack of executive wingtips, and not the solitary pacing of a night watchman. It was a stacked formation. 3 men, moving tightly together, heading straight for Vianne Morgan's office. Lexington slowly lowered his wrench. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself to fix the fan, pack his tools, and go home to relieve the babysitter. But the hair on the back of his neck was standing up, and his gut, the same gut that had saved his squad from a buried IED outside Kandahar, was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Silently, Lexington adjusted his grip on the ladder. He pulled a heavy steel maglite from his belt and quietly shifted his weight, sliding horizontally through the cavernous crawl space above the ceiling tiles, moving like a ghost toward the CEO's office. Vianne Morgan rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the localized migraine forming behind her left eye. The glow of her massive curved monitors cast a pale, bluish light over her sharp features. Spread across her desk were the final acquisition contracts. In less than 48 hours, she was going to finalize a merger with a Swiss pharmaceutical giant, ensuring Neuro-Regen reached global distribution. The move would effectively bankrupt her biggest competitor, Caldwell Therapeutics, a massive conglomerate run by Richard Caldwell, a man notorious for his ruthless, often illegal, business practices. Caldwell had tried to buy her out 6 times in the last year. She had rejected him every single time. Vianne reached for her cold coffee, her mind drifting to the logistics of Monday's press conference. She was so absorbed in the data that she barely registered the quiet hiss of the pneumatic office doors sliding open. She didn't look up immediately. "Darby, I told you I wasn't to be disturbed until midnight. I need these projections verified. I'm afraid the schedule has been accelerated. Ms. Morgan." The voice belonged to Darby Taylor, but the tone was entirely wrong. It lacked the usual subservient polish. It was flat, hard, and entirely devoid of respect. Vianne snapped her head up. Darby stood in the center of the vast office. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, but his hands were resting casually on his hips, pushing his jacket back to reveal the matte black handle of a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol holstered at his belt. Behind him stood 3 men. They wore entirely unmarked black tactical clothing, no Aegis logos, no name tags. Their faces were obscured by dark balaclavas, and they were heavily armed. One of them carried a portable EMP jammer, already glowing with a faint green light, ensuring no distress signals could leave the room. Vianne felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. The cold realization of betrayal washed over her like ice water. She was a woman who calculated risk for a living, and the math in front of her was instantly, terrifyingly clear. "Darby," Vianne said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She slowly stood up, placing her hands flat on the desk. "What exactly is this?" This is a hostile takeover, Vianne," Darby said, stepping forward. He didn't bother using her formal title. "Richard Caldwell sends his regards. You sold me out." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She glanced at the panic button under the lip of her desk. "Don't bother," Darby sighed, catching the micro-movement of her eyes. The building's internal networks has been severed. The exterior cameras are looping footage from last Tuesday. The night shift lobby guards have been relieved of duty. You are entirely cut off. Do you have any idea what Caldwell will do to this company? Vianne demanded, her voice rising, anger temporarily overriding her fear. He doesn't want to distribute Neuro-Regen. He wants to bury it. It threatens his entire pain management portfolio. He'll kill the project. I don't care about the medicine, Darby replied coldly. I care about the wire transfer that cleared an offshore account in the Caymans 20 minutes ago. An amount of money that ensures I never have to take orders from a spoiled, entitled brat ever again. Darby pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto her desk. It clattered against her coffee cup. Richard requires your biometric signature to authorize the transfer of the patent rights to a Caldwell shell company, Darby explained, checking his watch. Once the transfer is complete, we're going to take a walk up to the roof. It's a tragic story, really. The pressure of the Swiss merger became too much. The brilliant CEO leaped from the 54th floor. An open and shut suicide. Vianne stared at the men. She was going to die tonight. She knew it with absolute certainty. If she signed, they would throw her off the roof. If she didn't sign, they would torture her until she did, and then throw her off the roof. Above them, hidden in the darkness of the ventilation shaft, Lexington West lay perfectly still. He was peering down through the slats of the aluminum air return grill, directly over Vianne's desk. He had heard every word. Lexington closed his eyes. Walk away, a voice in his head whispered. You have a daughter. If you die here tonight, Chloe ends up in the foster system. She won't get her medicine. This isn't your war. These are billionaires fighting over billions. Walk away. He started to slowly inch backward in the cramped, dusty shaft. He could sneak out, get to a stairwell, and call the police from 3 blocks away. That was the smart play. That was the fatherly play. Down below, Vianne crossed her arms, lifting her chin in a final act of defiance. I'm not signing a damn thing, Darby. If you're going to kill me, just do it. But Caldwell isn't getting my life's work. Darby's face hardened. He nodded to the largest of the 3 mercenaries, a hulking man with a thick, tattooed neck. Make her sign, Darby ordered. I don't care if you have to break her fingers to get them on the scanner. Just get it done. The mercenary grunted, stepping forward with heavy, predatory strides. Vianne backed up, her bravado faltering as the sheer physical reality of the man bore down on her. She backed into the floor-to-ceiling window. Trapped. The mercenary lunged, his massive hand shooting out. He grabbed Vianne roughly by the throat, slamming her backward against the glass. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She gasped, grabbing at his thick forearm, her manicured nails uselessly scratching against his tactical sleeves. He reached for her right hand, brutally twisting her wrist to force her fingers toward the biometric scanner on the tablet. Vianne let out a sharp cry of pain, tears springing to her eyes as her wrist bones ground together. Up in the ceiling, the sound of her cry hit Lexington like a physical blow. The math in his head instantly evaporated. He didn't see a billionaire CEO. He saw a terrified woman being brutalized by men who thought power meant they could do whatever they wanted. The switch in Lexington's brain, the one that had lain dormant since his honorable discharge, flipped with a violent, electrifying snap. He wasn't Lexington the HVAC guy anymore. He was Staff Sergeant West, and he was going to war. The mercenary tightened his grip on Vianne's throat, cutting off her oxygen. The edges of her vision began to blur with dark, fuzzy spots. She kicked out, her heel connecting with his shin, but the man didn't even flinch. "Hold still, you little bitch!" The mercenary growled, wrenching her arm downward. Before Vianne could process her impending blackout, the ceiling above them literally exploded. A heavy steel grate, accompanied by a shower of acoustic dust, plaster, and shattered fiberglass, crashed down onto the center of the mahogany desk. Immediately behind it descended a blur of dark blue fabric and coiled muscle. Lexington West dropped 10 feet from the ceiling, landing in a perfect, shock-absorbing crouch directly on the desk. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to assess. He was already in motion. "Don't touch her!" Lexington roared, a guttural, terrifying sound that seemed to shake the glass of the office. The mercenary holding Vianne whipped his head around, his eyes widening in shock. That fraction of a second was all Lexington needed. Launching himself off the desk, Lexington swung the heavy, 2.5-pound steel wrench he held in his right hand. He didn't aim for the head. Tactical helmets and thick skulls made that a gamble. He aimed for the joint. The solid steel connected with the mercenary's left knee with a sickening crack. The man let out a high-pitched shriek as his knee instantly buckled backward, bending at an impossible, unnatural angle. His grip on Vianne's throat vanished as his entire body collapsed toward the floor. Before the man even hit the carpet, Lexington pivoted. The second mercenary was already raising a suppressed submachine gun. But he was reacting to a ghost. Lexington closed the distance in a single step, stepping inside the barrel's turning radius. He drove the heavy base of his metal maglite flashlight directly into the man's throat, crushing the larynx. The second man dropped his weapon, clutching his neck, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as he collapsed, choking on his own blood. "Kill him!" Darby Taylor screamed, drawing his USP sidearm and backpedaling toward the door. The third mercenary, better trained than the others, didn't panic. He took a measured half-step back to create distance and leveled his weapon at Lexington's chest. Lexington had no cover. He reacted with brutal efficiency. He grabbed the tactical vest of the choking man in front of him, hauling the dying mercenary up with terrifying strength and using him as a fleshy shield just as the third man opened fire. Thwip, thwip, thwip! The suppressed rounds thudded heavily into the human shield. The force pushed Lexington backward. But he held his ground. He reached down to his tool belt, his fingers finding his heavy-duty box cutter. With a flick of his thumb, the razor-sharp blade extended, throwing the dead weight of his human shield forward to obscure the shooter's vision. Lexington lunged underneath the falling body. He drove the box cutter upward, burying it deep into the soft, unarmored flesh of the third mercenary's inner thigh, slicing through the femoral artery. The man screamed, dropping his gun and clapping his hands over his leg as dark arterial blood sprayed across the pristine white carpet. He would be unconscious in 30 seconds, dead in 2 minutes. The entire violent ballet had taken less than 8 seconds. Darby Taylor was frozen in the doorway, his pistol raised but his hands shaking. He had expected to intimidate a pampered CEO. He had not expected a highly trained apex predator to drop from the ceiling and slaughter his elite kill team with hardware store tools. Darby fired 2 panicked, uncoordinated shots. One shattered the glass of a display case. The other buried itself in the mahogany desk. Lexington didn't charge him. He knew the odds of dodging bullets from a desperate man. Instead, Lexington grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the desk and hurled it like a baseball straight at Darby's head. Darby ducked, his shot going wild. Lexington spun toward Vianne. She was slumped against the window, clutching her bruised throat, her eyes wide with absolute, paralyzed horror. She was looking at Lexington not as a savior, but as a monster who had just introduced unspeakable violence into her sanctuary. "Get up!" Lexington barked, his voice carrying the unquestionable authority of a battlefield commander. Vianne couldn't move. Her legs refused to work. The shock of the violence had overloaded her nervous system. "I said, Get up! Lexington didn't wait. He crossed the room, grabbed her by the lapels of her expensive blazer, and hauled her to her feet. If we stay here, we die. He's going to call for backup. We have to move, now. Who are you? She gasped, coughing violently. Maintenance. Lexington grunted. He glanced at the main doors. He could already hear the heavy thud of combat boots rushing down the carpeted hallway. Darby had a radio. The rest of the Rogue Aegis team was converging on the penthouse. We can't use the elevators, Lexington said rapidly, his eyes scanning the room. They'll cut the power and trap us in a box. Stairwells will be fatal funnels. They'll set up a kill box on the landing. But then we're trapped, Vianne whispered, panic rising in her chest again. There's no other way out. For executives, there isn't, Lexington said grimly. He dragged her toward a seamless, wood-paneled wall on the far side of the office, the private executive restroom. But I know the bones of this building. He kicked the restroom door open and pulled her inside. He immediately went to the large, mirrored vanity. Help me pull this, he ordered, gripping the edge of the heavy marble counter. What? Pull the damn counter! Lexington yelled. Startled into action, Vianne grabbed the edge, ignoring the searing pain in her twisted wrist. Together, they heaved. The vanity wasn't bolted to the wall. It was on heavy-duty casters designed to allow plumbing access. It swung out, revealing a dark, cavernous maintenance shaft, filled with thick PVC pipes and heavy electrical conduits. Get in, Lexington ordered, pushing her toward the darkness. I can't. The men coming down that hall aren't going to ask for your signature anymore, Lexington said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. They are going to execute you. You go into that hole, or you die on this tile. Choose. The sound of the office doors bursting open echoed from the main room. Voices shouted commands. Vianne took one look at Lexington's face, stoic, resolute, and completely unafraid, and squeezed herself into the dusty, narrow maintenance shaft. Lexington followed instantly, pulling the heavy marble vanity back into place, just as the bathroom door was kicked open. Absolute darkness enveloped them. The heavy thud of boots and muffled cursing echoed through the wall, mere inches from their faces. Vianne clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle her ragged breathing. In the pitch black, Lexington's rough, calloused hand found her shoulder. He gave it a firm, steadying squeeze. Follow me, he whispered, turning on his mag light and setting the beam to its dimmest red light setting. And stay quiet. The hunt is on. Dust motes danced in the faint crimson beam of Lexington's flashlight, swirling like microscopic snow in the claustrophobic air of the utility shaft. Behind the heavy marble vanity, the muffled shouts of Darby Taylor and his heavily armed kill team sounded like dogs barking through thick glass. They were tearing the executive restroom apart, their boots stomping against the tile, weapons smashing into shower glass and cabinet doors. Down in the dock, Vianne Morgan was trembling so violently she thought her bones might rattle apart. She was pressed flat against a massive cast-iron sewage pipe, the cold metal seeping through the thin silk of her designer blouse. Her injured wrist throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic pulse that synced perfectly with her racing heart. Lexington stood inches from her, his body a solid, immovable wall between her and the vanity they had just closed. He held a finger to his lips, staring intently at the crack of light visible through the edges of the marble. He wasn't breathing heavily. His heart rate was terrifyingly steady. To Vianne, it was like standing next to a dormant machine that had just violently powered down, waiting only for the right signal to activate again. They're gone! Darby's muffled voice echoed from the other side of the wall. Check the elevator shafts. Check the stairwells. They couldn't have just evaporated. If Caldwell finds out we lost her, none of us are walking out of this city alive." The heavy footsteps retreated, the bathroom door slamming shut, plunging the space back into relative silence. Lexington finally exhaled, turning the red beam of his flashlight downward. The shaft plunged into an abyss of overlapping pipes, electrical conduits, and heavy steel crossbeams. Running vertically down the concrete wall was a rusted steel service ladder. "We need to go down," Lexington whispered, his voice barely carrying over the low hum of the building's infrastructure. "They'll lock down the perimeter and start a floor-by-floor sweep from the top down. We have to stay ahead of the net." "Down where?" Vianne whispered back, her voice catching. She looked at her trembling hands. "I'm wearing 3-inch heels and a skirt. My wrist feels like it's broken. I don't even know how to climb down that." Lexington didn't offer sympathy. He didn't have time for it. He reached out, grabbed the heel of her expensive Italian leather pump, and ruthlessly snapped it off. Vianne gasped, more out of shock than anger. "Give me the other one," Lexington demanded, extending his hand. Vianne stared at him for a fraction of a second, before kicking off the other shoe. Lexington caught it, snapped the heel off against a steel pipe, and handed them both back to her. "Put them on. Better than barefoot on rusted grating. As for your wrist, you're going to have to deal with the pain. If you slip, you'll fall 10 stories before you hit a junction box. Do you understand?" "You're very direct," Vianne managed, slipping the ruined shoes back onto her feet. "I'm keeping you alive," Lexington replied, turning his back to her and stepping onto the ladder. "Stay close. If I stop, you stop." They began their descent. The shaft was sweltering, the ambient heat from the massive server farms on the floors below, rising like a physical weight. Within minutes, Vianne was drenched in sweat, her tailored blazer ruined, her hair plastered to her forehead. Every time she gripped a steel rung with her right hand, a blinding flash of agony shot up her forearm. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, refusing to cry out. She watched the man below her. Lexington moved with a predatory grace, descending the ladder with practiced, mechanical efficiency. His heavy tool belt clinked softly, but otherwise, he made no sound. "Why did you do it?" Vianne whispered, the darkness emboldening her to break the silence. "You could have walked away. No one would have known you were there. You have a family." Lexington stopped on the ladder, his face illuminated only by the faint red bounce of his flashlight. He didn't look up. "I have a daughter," Lexington said, his voice flat. "Her name is Chloe. She's 8. "Then why risk your life for someone you don't even know?" "Because of her," Lexington said, his grip tightening on the rusted steel. "Because I have to look her in the eye tomorrow and tell her the world isn't just full of monsters who take whatever they want. And because I know what your company is building. Neuro-Regen. I read the internal memos I fish out of the recycling bins." Vianne blinked in surprise. "You read my corporate waste?" "I read everything," Lexington corrected. "Chloe has a congenital nerve condition. Your drug is the only thing that might ever fix her. If Caldwell gets his hands on your company, he buries the patent to protect his opioid profits. I'm not saving you. Ms. Morgan, I'm saving my daughter." He resumed his descent, leaving Vianne to process the blunt, brutal honesty of his words. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a desperate father, and she was simply a strategic asset in a war he was fighting for his child. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, Lexington stopped abruptly. They were somewhere around the 42nd floor. The ladder ended at a narrow steel grate. "Ah, shaft ends here," Lexington muttered, shining his light around. We have to cross over into the primary ventilation duct to reach the maintenance stairs. He pushed up on a heavy aluminum access panel set into the concrete wall. It groaned in protest, grinding against years of accumulated grime, before popping open. Lexington slid through the narrow opening, then reached back to help Vianne. She grabbed his forearm, allowing him to pull her through. They spilled out into a massive, cavernous space that sounded like the inside of a jet engine. They had reached the tertiary mechanical floor. The mechanical floor spanned the entire width and breadth of the skyscraper. It was a terrifying, industrial wasteland, devoid of cubicles, glass walls, or corporate luxury. Instead, it was a labyrinth of gargantuan water chillers, massive air-handling units, and thick, insulated pipes carrying superheated steam and coolant. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, grease, and burning dust. The only light came from the sickly yellow glow of emergency backup bulbs spaced 50 feet apart. "Stay low," Lexington instructed, pressing his back against the vibrating metal housing of a commercial boiler. "We need to reach the service freight elevator on the north side. It operates on an independent analog circuit. They can't shut it down from the security room." Vianne nodded, her breathing shallow. She felt like an alien on her own planet. She owned this building, yet she had never set foot on this floor. It was Lexington's world, not hers. They began to move, darting between the massive pieces of machinery. Lexington moved with deliberate caution, pausing at every intersection of pipes, checking his angles. Suddenly, the harsh, electronic squawk of a public address system echoed through the mechanical floor. "Vianne," Darby Taylor's voice boomed, dripping with a terrifying calmness. "I know you're in the walls. We found the broken heels of your shoes on the 48th floor grate. You're slowing him down, whoever this guy is. He's a professional, but he can't protect you against 12 heavily armed men. Caldwell has authorized a secondary payout. Come out, sign the transfer, and I will let the man live. Refuse, and we will hunt you both down like animals." Vianne froze, her eyes darting toward the ceiling speakers. "He's lying," she whispered. "I know," Lexington said, checking the charge on his maglite. "But he knows where we are now. They're going to box us in." As if on cue, the heavy steel fire doors on the east side of the mechanical floor clanged open. The unmistakable sweep of bright white tactical flashlights pierced the gloom, cutting through the steam venting from a nearby pressure valve. "Two-man team," Lexington whispered, peering around the edge of a water tank. "Assault rifles, body armor. They're sweeping the grid." "We can't fight them," Vianne said, panic seizing her chest. "They have armor." "Armor stops bullets," Lexington said coldly. "It doesn't stop physics." Lexington looked around, his eyes instantly calculating the mechanical layout of the room. He pointed to a large, insulated pipe running directly above a narrow walkway the mercenaries were approaching. A heavy brass release valve, caked in grease, jutted out from its side. "That's the primary coolant line for the server farm," Lexington said, stripping off his heavy tool belt and handing it to Vianne. "Hold this. Don't move. What are you doing?" "Being a maintenance guy." Before Vianne could protest, Lexington vanished into the shadows, moving with horrifying silence for a man of his size. Vianne pressed herself into a tight alcove between two generators, clutching the heavy nylon tool belt to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the maze of machinery, she watched the two beams of tactical light sweep closer. The mercenaries were communicating with silent hand signals, moving flawlessly together, their weapons raised and ready to fire at the slightest provocation. 50 feet above them, crawling along the heavy steel I-beam that supported the ceiling, Lexington West, moved like a spider. He positioned himself directly over the brass release valve of the coolant line. The mercenaries walked directly beneath him. Lexington didn't hesitate. He dropped from the beam, his legs wrapping around the thick, insulated pipe to break his fall, and slammed the heel of his boot directly into the locking lever of the brass valve. The lever snapped downward. The resulting explosion of sound was deafening. Highly pressurized, super-chilled liquid Freon blasted out of the valve at 300 pounds per square inch, instantly vaporizing into a thick, blinding, sub-zero cloud. The blast hit the two mercenaries directly from above. The temperature drop was instantaneous and catastrophic. One mercenary screamed, instinctively throwing his hands up to protect his face. The freezing gas crystallized the moisture on his skin and in his eyes in a microsecond. He stumbled backward, blindly, firing a burst of automatic weapon fire into the ceiling before dropping his rifle, clawing frantically at his freezing face. The second mercenary tried to dive out of the expanding cloud of freezing gas, but the sudden shock of the temperature change seized his muscles. Lexington didn't give them a chance to recover. He dropped from the pipe, landing heavily on the metal grating. He grabbed a massive 3-foot-long iron pipe wrench from a nearby workbench. Through the thick, freezing fog, Lexington swung the iron wrench like a baseball bat. The heavy metal connected with the first mercenary's tactical helmet with a bone-jarring clang. The man crumpled instantly, his armor useless against the sheer blunt force trauma to his skull. The second mercenary, half-blinded and shivering violently, raised his weapon. Lexington closed the distance, swatting the barrel of the rifle aside with the handle of the wrench, and drove the heavy iron head directly into the center of the man's chest plate. The armor stopped the penetration, but the kinetic force cracked the man's sternum. As the mercenary gasped for air, Lexington swept his leg out, catching the man behind the knees and dropping him hard onto the steel grating. A swift, brutal strike with the base of the flashlight to the temple ended the fight. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the angry hiss of the venting Freon. Lexington stood over the two unconscious men, his chest heaving, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He reached down and stripped 2 spare magazines, a tactical radio, and a combat knife from the fallen men. He walked back to where Vianne was hiding. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer, unadulterated violence she had just witnessed. "You didn't shoot them," she breathed, noting the discarded rifles on the floor. "Guns make noise. Noise brings more of them," Lexington said, retrieving his tool belt from her trembling hands. He tossed her one of the mercenaries' tactical radios. "Keep that. Listen for movement. We need to get to the freight elevator." Vianne caught the radio, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. For the first time all night, she realized that she wasn't just a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a participant. "Lexington," she said, her voice steadier than it had been since Darby breached her office. He paused, looking back at her. "The freight elevator is analog." "Yes," Vianne said, her brilliant mind finally cutting through her panic. "But it requires a maintenance master key to operate the manual override panel. Do you have one?" Lexington checked his belt, cursing softly under his breath. "No. The site manager keeps the master keys locked in a biometric safe on the lobby level." Vianne managed a small, grim smile. "I'm the CEO. My biometrics override every lock in this building, including the maintenance safes. But I have to reach a terminal to bypass the elevator's analog lock from the main security grid." "Where is the nearest terminal?" Lexington asked, his eyes narrowing. "Floor 35, Vianne replied. "The Data Analytics Center, but it's heavily fortified. It's essentially a glass cage." Lexington looked at the venting Freon, then down at the unconscious mercenaries. He keyed the radio he had taken. Silence. "They'll find these two in less than 5 minutes," Lexington said. He looked at Vianne, assessing her torn clothes, her bruised throat, and the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes. 35th floor it is. Let's go to work." The descent to the 35th floor was a grueling exercise in endurance. They navigated through a labyrinth of secondary air return ducts and narrow, concrete-lined utility stairwells that smelled of ozone and stale cigarette smoke left behind by careless contractors. By the time they reached the access door for the Data Analytics Center, Vianne's muscles were trembling uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had initially propelled her was rapidly burning out, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion and the sharp, relentless throbbing of her sprained wrist. Lexington pressed his ear against the heavy fire door, listening intently before smoothly swiping a stolen mercenary keycard over the magnetic lock. A soft green light blinked, and he eased the door open. The 35th floor was a stark contrast to the gritty, industrial wasteland of the mechanical level above. This was the brain of Morgan Biogen. It was a vast, open-plan space kept at a frigid 62 degrees. Row upon row of towering, matte black server racks hummed with immense digital power. Thousands of tiny blue and green LED lights blinking in the darkness like a mechanized constellation. In the exact center of the floor stood the glass cage, a soundproof, reinforced glass cube, housing the primary administrative terminals. "The freight elevator bank is on the far north wall," Vianne whispered, pointing through the endless aisles of servers. "But the manual override terminal is inside that glass room." Lexington scanned the sprawling floor. The layout was a tactical nightmare. The server racks provided ample cover, but the glass cube in the center was exposed from all 360 degrees. It was a fishbowl. If they were caught inside, there would be nowhere to hide. "How long will it take you to bypass the analog lock?" Lexington asked, checking the battery on his mag light. 3 minutes, Vianne said, clutching her injured wrist against her chest. "Maybe 4, depending on whether Darby's men have initiated a system-wide firewall lockdown." "You have 2, Lexington replied grimly. "Move." They slipped into the room, using the towering server racks as cover, advancing silently down the narrow, frigid aisles. When they reached the central glass cube, Vianne pressed her uninjured left hand against the biometric scanner next to the door. A red laser swept over her fingerprints, followed by a soft chime. The heavy glass door unsealed with a pneumatic hiss. Vianne rushed inside and collapsed into the leather chair in front of the main terminal. Her fingers, though shaking, flew across the keyboard with practiced, blistering speed. Lines of code began to cascade down the massive, ultra-wide monitor, illuminating her pale face in a ghostly white glow. Lexington did not go inside. He stayed in the shadows just outside the cube, his eyes scanning the darkness, his hand gripping the heavy iron wrench he had taken from the mechanical floor. Suddenly, the stolen tactical radio clipped to Lexington's belt crackled to life. "I have to admit, I'm impressed." Darby Taylor's voice echoed through the small speaker. The false civility was gone, replaced by a venomous, sharp edge. "We ran your face through the lobby's facial recognition archives. Lexington West, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, honorable discharge, Tier 2 maintenance contractor. You're punching way out of your weight class." "Lexington." Lexington didn't touch the radio. He kept his eyes fixed on the elevator banks. "I know you can hear me, West," Darby continued, his voice dripping with malice. "I also know about the crippling debt you're in. Vanguard Facilities doesn't pay enough to cover the experimental treatments at Seattle Children's Neurological Center, do they? Room 412, isn't it? Chloe." Inside the glass cube, Vianne's hands froze over the keyboard. She looked up, horrified, staring at Lexington through the glass. "Caldwell has deep pockets." "Lexington," Darby purred. "If you walk away right now, leave the woman in the server room, and go home. $2 million will be deposited into your account by morning. Chloe gets her medicine. You get your life back. But if you insist on playing the hero, I have a two-man team idling in a black SUV outside Seattle Children's right now. It would be a tragedy if someone slipped into room 412 and turned off her life support." A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the server floor, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans. Vianne stared at Lexington. She saw the sudden, rigid tension in his shoulders. She saw the way his knuckles turned white around the iron wrench. This was the breaking point. Darby had found the one lever that could move this immovable man. He was offering Lexington exactly what he wanted. And all Lexington had to do was step aside. Lexington slowly reached down and unclipped the radio from his belt. He pressed the transmission button. "Darby," Lexington said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of any panic or hesitation. "Do we have a deal, Mr. West?" Darby asked. "If your men are outside that hospital, they are on a public street," Lexington stated, his voice a low, lethal gravel. "Which means they are on camera. If anything happens to my daughter, the police will find them. But if you come down to this floor, nobody is going to find you." Lexington released the button and violently crushed the radio under the heel of his heavy work boot, snapping the plastic and silencing Darby forever. He looked through the glass at Vianne. She was staring at him with a mixture of absolute awe and terror. "Get back to work," Lexington ordered, his eyes burning with a cold, focused fury. "They know exactly where we are now. They're coming." Lexington didn't wait by the door. He immediately moved into the server aisles. He needed to change the environment. He found a massive, heavy-duty fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He ripped it down, carried it to the main intersection of the server aisles, the only path leading directly to the glass cage, and jammed the pin open, tossing it onto the floor. A massive, blinding cloud of thick, white chemical retardant began to billow out, rapidly filling the intersection and cutting off all visibility. Next, he opened a floor grate, exposing the thick, high-voltage power cables that fed the server banks. With a swift, brutal slash of his heavy-duty box cutter, he stripped the thick rubber insulation away from a primary conduit, leaving the live, sparking wires exposed over the metal floor grating. He had just stepped back into the shadows when the heavy fire doors at the far end of the room blew open. They didn't come in stealthily this time. Darby had sent his heavy hitters. 4 men, clad in heavy tactical gear and armed with suppressed submachine guns, flooded into the server room. They fanned out with militaristic precision, their weapon-mounted flashlights cutting sharp, blinding arcs through the darkness. "Or spread out, check the aisles. If you see the contractor, put him down immediately," barked the lead mercenary. A scarred, broad-shouldered man named Gage. "System override at 70%, Vianne shouted from inside the glass cage, her voice muffled but frantic. "I need 1 more minute." "You don't have a minute," Gage yelled, spotting the illuminated glass cube. "Fire!" Thwip, 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 thwip. A hail of suppressed gunfire erupted. The reinforced glass of the cage spider-webbed violently under the barrage, turning opaque white as bullets buried themselves in the ballistic layering. Vianne screamed, dropping to the floor and pulling the keyboard down with her, continuing to type blindly from her knees as the glass above her head began to buckle and crack. 2 of the mercenaries sprinted down the main aisle, heading straight for the glass cage. They hit the thick wall of white chemical smoke billowing from the extinguisher Lexington had rigged. "Can't see a damn thing," one of them shouted, slowing his pace and raising his rifle. "Thermals are useless through this chemical foam." They took another step forward, their boots stepping blindly onto the exposed metal floor. Grating, hidden in the shadows, Lexington kicked a heavy, insulated water cooler jug over, sending a gallon of purified water rushing across the slick floor, straight into the exposed, sparking high-voltage wires he had stripped. The water hit the live current. The metal grating instantly became a massive conductor. A brilliant, blinding arc of blue electricity flashed through the smoke. The two mercenaries violently convulsed as thousands of volts surged through their tactical boots and into their bodies. Their muscles seized instantly, locking them in a terrifying, rigid posture for 3 agonizing seconds before the circuit breaker finally tripped, plunging that half of the room into absolute darkness. The two men collapsed to the floor, smoking and completely incapacitated. "Contact left! Contact left!" Gage roared, firing blindly into the smoke. Lexington was already moving. He flanked the third mercenary, dropping from the top of a server rack like a falling anvil. He landed squarely on the man's shoulders, driving him face first into the unforgiving metal edge of a server tower. The man crumpled without a sound, his helmet cracking against the steel. But Gage was a veteran. He heard the impact and pivoted, his submachine gun tracking the movement. He didn't fire wildly. He aimed and pulled the trigger in a tight, controlled burst. Lexington twisted violently, diving behind the nearest server rack. He was fast, but he wasn't faster than a bullet. A searing, white-hot line of agony ripped through his left flank, just above his hip. The impact spun him around, slamming him hard against the metal chassis of the servers. Lexington grunted, clapping his hand over his side. The thick, wet warmth of his own blood instantly soaked through his uniform shirt. "Got you, you son of a bitch," Gage growled, advancing slowly, keeping his weapon trained on the narrow gap between the servers where Lexington had fallen. Inside the cage, the progress bar hit 100%. The screen flashed a brilliant green. "It's done," Vianne screamed. "The freight elevator is unlocked!" Gage ignored her. He was 10 feet away from Lexington. "Taylor said you were good, West, but you brought a wrench to a gunfight." Lexington lay on the floor, his vision swimming slightly from the shock of the gunshot wound. Gage stepped into the aisle, raising his weapon for the execution shot. Lexington didn't try to stand. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached up and grabbed the heavy, industrial lever of the server rack's emergency server release mechanism, a system designed to eject the massive 300-pound metal server trays for rapid maintenance. He yanked the lever down with all his remaining strength. Right as Gage pulled the trigger, the massive steel tray, loaded with heavy hard drives, ejected from the rack at waist height with terrifying, spring-loaded force. It slammed directly into Gage's midsection like a battering ram. The mercenary gasped, the wind violently expelled from his lungs, his shot going wide and shattering a fluorescent light overhead. Lexington launched himself off the floor, ignoring the tearing pain in his side. He drove his shoulder directly into Gage's chest, tackling the larger man backward. They crashed through the frosted glass wall of a nearby conference room, a shower of safety glass raining down around them. Gage scrambled to bring his sidearm to bear, but Lexington was relentless. He grabbed Gage's wrist, pinning it to the floor, and brought his heavy elbow down onto the man's face in a brutal, rapid succession of strikes. 1, 2, 3. Gage's eyes rolled back, his body going limp. Lexington collapsed next to him, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He looked down at his side. The bullet had passed clean through his oblique muscle, a flesh wound, but it was bleeding heavily. "Lexington!" Vianne had scrambled out of the shattered glass cage. She ran to him, dropping to her knees amid the broken glass, her eyes wide with terror as she saw the dark pool of blood expanding on the floor. "I'm fine," Lexington rasped, his teeth gritted against the pain. He forced himself to sit up, wrapping his heavy canvas uniform jacket tightly around his waist to stem the bleeding. "The elevator. Is it unlocked?" "Yes," Vianne said, her voice shaking. "It's on its way up from the basement." A loud, mechanical ding echoed from the far end of the floor. The heavy steel doors of the freight elevator slowly ground open. "Help me up," Lexington grunted, extending a blood-stained hand to the billionaire CEO. Vianne didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, draping it over her shoulder, ignoring the ruin of her own clothes and the pain in her wrist. Together, the wounded contractor and the besieged executive hobbled across the server floor, stepping over downed mercenaries and shattered glass. They practically fell into the cavernous, steel-walled freight elevator. Vianne slammed her uninjured hand against the button for the underground parking garage. The heavy metal doors began to slide shut, just as the distant sounds of shouting echoed from the main stairwell. Darby was bringing the rest of his men. The doors closed with a resounding metallic thud, sealing them inside. The elevator lurched downward. Lexington slid down the cold steel wall, leaving a streak of crimson behind him, and hit the floor hard. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Vianne dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his side to keep the pressure on the wound. "You're bleeding too much," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Why didn't you take Darby's deal? He offered you the money for Chloe." "You could have walked away." Lexington looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain but his jaw set like stone. "Because a man who threatens a child in a hospital bed doesn't leave witnesses," Lexington whispered, his breathing shallow. "He would have killed you, and then he would have killed me to tie up the loose ends. And then Chloe would have been completely alone." He reached out, his bloodied fingers weakly gripping her wrist. "We're going to the basement," Lexington said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Darby isn't stupid. He knows where this elevator goes. He's going to have the rest of his team waiting for us in the garage. We have one fight left, Vianne. Just one more." Down in the metallic belly of the skyscraper, the freight elevator continued its relentless plunge toward the subterranean parking garage. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered, casting harsh shadows across Lexington's pale, sweat-drenched face. He had ripped a long strip of fabric from his uniform shirt, wrapping it tightly around his waist to act as a makeshift tourniquet. The bleeding had slowed to a steady seep, but the blood loss was making his hands tremble. "Listen to me," Lexington commanded, his voice strained but anchored by iron willpower. He looked at Vianne, who was kneeling beside him, her tailored clothes ruined, her hands stained with his blood. "When these doors open, it's going to be a firing squad. Darby isn't going to negotiate anymore. He's running out of time, and he's desperate." Vianne swallowed hard, nodding. "What do we do?" "We don't ride this box to the bottom," Lexington said. He forced himself up, fighting a wave of debilitating nausea, and pointed to the maintenance hatch set into the ceiling of the elevator car. "I'm going to boost you up. Get on top of the car. When we hit the garage level, the doors will open. They'll focus on the empty interior. That's our only advantage." Vianne didn't argue. She climbed onto the heavy steel handrail lining the elevator wall. Lexington gritted his teeth, groaning as he placed his hands on her hips and shoved her upward. Vianne pushed the latch, throwing the metal panel aside. and scrambled onto the dusty, grease-covered roof of the elevator cab. Lexington grabbed the edges of the hatch. The pain in his side flared into a blinding white agony as he pulled his own body weight up, rolling onto the roof, just as the elevator began its final deceleration sequence. "Stay flat," Lexington whispered, drawing the stolen combat knife from his belt. Below them, the elevator chimed. The heavy mechanical doors slid open, revealing the cavernous concrete expanse of executive parking level sub-3. Instantly, the deafening roar of automatic gunfire erupted. 3 mercenaries had formed a semicircle around the elevator bank, unloading a merciless barrage of suppressed rounds into the empty car. The interior mirrors shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the metal walls sparked as the bullets tore through the confined space. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" a voice balked. It was Darby. He stepped into view, his pistol raised, his impeccably tailored suit now slightly rumpled. He stared into the bullet-riddled, empty elevator. "Where the hell are they?" On top of the car, Lexington moved with silent, lethal precision. He grabbed the thick steel counterweight cable, running down the side of the shaft, wrapped his legs around it, and slid down the gap between the elevator car and the concrete wall. He dropped into the darkness of the garage, landing soundlessly behind a massive concrete support pillar, entirely flanking the hit squad. Vianne remained on the roof, peering over the edge. She saw Darby and his 3 remaining men slowly advancing toward the open elevator. Beyond them, parked in its designated VIP spot, was her vehicle, a custom-built, armored Range Rover Sentinel. It was designed to withstand small arms fire and explosives. It was a rolling fortress, and the keys were in her pocket. She just had to get to it. Lexington didn't give the mercenaries time to realize the threat was behind them. He leaned around the pillar and hurled the heavy steel maglite he had carried all night. It sailed through the air and smashed directly into the main breaker box on the wall. Sparks showered down, and the entire parking level plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. "Night vision! Goggles down!" Darby screamed, panicking. But as the mercenaries reached up to pull their tactical optics over their eyes, Lexington struck. He emerged from the shadows like a demon, ignoring the tearing pain in his side. He grabbed the rearmost mercenary, clapping one hand over the man's mouth and driving the combat knife up under the edge of his Kevlar vest. The man went limp instantly, and Lexington lowered him silently to the concrete. 2 left, plus Darby. Vianne used the darkness and the confusion to drop from the elevator roof. She hit the floor hard, jarring her injured wrist, but she bit down on her lip to stifle a cry. Keeping low, she crawled frantically beneath the chassis of the parked executive cars, inching closer to her Range Rover. Suddenly, a blinding beam of tactical light cut through the dark. One of the mercenaries had abandoned his night vision and switched to his weapon light, sweeping the garage. The beam caught the trail of Lexington's blood, leading away from the pillar. "I have his blood trail!" the mercenary shouted, tracking the crimson spots. "He's wounded! Moving right!" The 2 mercenaries converged on Lexington's position. Lexington was pinned behind a line of luxury sedans, his energy rapidly depleting. He had no gun, no flashlight, and his body was shutting down from blood loss. He gripped his bloodied knife, preparing for a final, desperate melee charge, just as the mercenaries rounded the corner, raising their rifles to execute him. The garage was illuminated by a blinding, explosive burst of light. The high-beam LED headlights of Vianne's armored Range Rover snapped on, instantly blinding the 2 mercenaries who were staring directly into them with their night vision goggles still strapped to their helmets. They shrieked in pain, clawing at their faces as the intensified light burned their retinas. The massive engine of the Range Rover roared to life. Vianne slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped on the accelerator. The 5,000-pound armored SUV surged forward like a missile. It slammed into the two blinded mercenaries, throwing them violently over the hood and sending them crashing into a concrete wall. They collapsed into an unconscious heap amid a shower of broken taillights and twisted metal. Lexington gasped, leaning heavily against a parked car, clutching his side. He looked at the Range Rover, a breathless laugh escaping his lips. The passenger door swung open. Vianne leaned across the center console, her face bruised but her eyes burning with fierce adrenaline. "Get in!" she yelled. Lexington stumbled toward the SUV, but a gunshot rang out, shattering the side mirror mere inches from his head. "Nobody is leaving!" Darby roared, stepping out from behind a structural column. He was completely unhinged now, holding his USP tactical pistol with both hands, aiming directly at Lexington's chest. "Caldwell will kill me if you walk out of here. If I'm going down, you're both dying with me." Darby fired twice. The first bullet sparked off the armored door of the Range Rover. The second caught Lexington in his right shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the oil-stained concrete. "Lexington!" Vianne screamed. Darby began to advance, his gun leveled at the fallen contractor. "You fought hard, West. You really did. But you're just a wrench monkey. You don't belong in this world." Lexington lay on the ground, his vision tunneling. The pain was absolute, a crushing weight pressing down on his chest. He was bleeding out. He could hear Darby's footsteps approaching. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he saw a hospital room. He saw the steady rise and fall of a ventilator. He saw Chloe's small, pale hand. Because of her, he had told Vianne. "Because I have to look her in the eye tomorrow." Darby stood directly over him, pointing the barrel of the gun at Lexington's face. "Goodbye, hero." Vianne didn't hesitate. She threw the Range Rover into reverse, the tires screeching on the polished concrete, and slammed the heavy rear bumper into the concrete pillar Darby was standing next to. The impact shook the entire garage. A massive chunk of the concrete pillar fractured and fell, crashing down onto Darby's shoulder. Darby cried out, his pistol firing wildly into the ceiling as he stumbled backward, losing his balance. That microsecond of distraction was all the opening Lexington needed. With a guttural, animalistic roar, Lexington surged upward from the floor, channeling every ounce of his remaining life force into one final movement. He lunged forward, tackling Darby around the waist. They crashed to the ground, rolling over the shattered concrete. Darby scrambled frantically to bring the gun up, but Lexington grabbed his wrist with both hands. With a brutal, torquing twist, Lexington snapped Darby's wrist backward. The bone popped audibly. Darby shrieked, dropping the weapon. Lexington didn't stop. He mounted the security director, raining heavy, bloodied fists down upon Darby's face. One strike, two, three. He hit him for the betrayal. He hit him for the terror in Vianne's eyes. But most of all, he hit him for daring to threaten an 8-year-old girl in a hospital bed. Darby went completely limp, his face a ruined mess. Lexington collapsed off the man, rolling onto his back, staring up at the dark concrete ceiling. The garage was finally completely silent, save for the idling engine of the Range Rover. Vianne scrambled out of the driver's seat and sprinted to Lexington's side. She dropped to her knees, pulling his heavy head into her lap, frantically pressing her hands against his bleeding shoulder and side. "Stay with me," she pleaded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, mixing with the dirt and blood on her face. "Lexington, stay with me! I'm calling an ambulance!" "Chloe!" Lexington rasped, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. "She's going to be fine," Vianne cried, gripping his hand tightly. "I swear to you, she is going to have everything she needs. Just hold on." In the distance, the faint, wailing sound of police sirens began to echo down the concrete ramp. The cavalry was coming. Lexington allowed his eyes to close, a faint, weary smile touching his lips as the darkness finally took him. 6 weeks later, sunlight streamed through the large, pristine windows of Seattle Children's Neurological Center, illuminating room 412 in a warm, golden glow. Lexington West sat in a comfortable armchair beside the bed. He was not wearing a faded maintenance uniform. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit that expertly hid the thick bandages still wrapped around his torso. In the bed, 8-year-old Chloe was awake. Her color was remarkably better, a healthy flush returning to her cheeks. She was sitting up, eagerly coloring in a book, her small hands moving with a fluid grace that had been absent for years. The door to the private room opened gently. Vianne Morgan stepped inside. She carried a massive bouquet of vibrant sunflowers. She looked completely different from the terrified woman in the high-rise. She carried an air of unshakable confidence, though her smile softened entirely when she looked at Lexington and his daughter. "How is the patient today?" Vianne asked warmly, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "The doctors said the 3rd round of Neuro-Regen is binding perfectly to her pathways," Lexington said, standing up. He looked at Vianne, the weight of 1,000 unspoken thank yous in his eyes. After the police had secured the building, the ensuing investigation had ripped through the corporate world like a hurricane. Darby Taylor was in federal custody. The digital trail Vianne had secured in the server room directly implicated Richard Caldwell in domestic terrorism and corporate espionage. Caldwell Therapeutics was dismantled, its assets frozen by the Department of Justice. Morgan Biogen had launched Neuro-Regen globally, changing the world of medicine forever. Vianne looked down at Chloe, gently brushing a lock of hair from the girl's forehead. Then she turned to Lexington. "Aegis Solutions has officially been dissolved as our security contractor," Vianne said, her business tone returning, though her eyes were warm. "I'm restructuring the entire division internally. I need a head of corporate security. Lexington, someone who understands the building, and someone who knows how to deal with monsters." Lexington looked at his daughter, who smiled brightly back at him, entirely oblivious to the blood that had been shed to secure her future. "I think," Lexington said, adjusting the cuffs of his new suit, "I can handle that." Did you enjoy this heart-pounding story of a father's relentless devotion and a corporate empire saved from the shadows? Hit that like button and share this video with your friends to support the channel. We bring you thrilling, original stories every single week, filled with action, drama, and unforgettable twists. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest cinematic narratives. Let us know in the comments which character was your favorite. Your support helps us create more incredible audio dramas. Stay tuned, stay safe, and keep watching.